Hi everyone, welcome back for the third and final part of our adapted version of my earlier talk at the Australian National Maritime Museum about Australian ghost ships. In this segment, we are going to look at two ships. The first one is relatively well known, the second one practically forgotten. Our first ship is probably more famous for the numerous searches done for it, and I believe a lot of searchers want to find this ship because it just so happens to be carrying 7,800 bars of gold. This ship disappeared in 1909 and is the Waratah. When it disappeared on the 27th of July 1909 off Durban, the Waratah was only on the return leg of its second voyage. It was essentially a still brand new ship. Having been completed in the previous year, the Waratah was the flagship of the Blue Anchor Line. This company was a small but growing company that serviced Australia and had been doing so for the last 20 to 30 years. Business was going very well for them, and they were upgrading their fleet, of which the Waratah was their latest flagship, and another 4 ships were in the works of a much larger design. When the Waratah disappeared, the only accounts of its final days came from a passenger who got off the ship at Durban. His name was Claude Sawyer. He got off the ship, messaged his wife, told her, "I'm all good, I'll be catching another ship." And when the investigators interviewed him, he had some interesting stories to tell. Claude Sawyer was an engineer by trade, so he certainly had a scientific mindset. It was also determined afterwards that he was of a nervous disposition, and doctors subscribed him laudanum to help with his nerves. What Claude Sawyer described is very interesting. He did note that the Waratah had a tendency to roll and hang on those rolls, so similar to the Kumbana, its metacentric height may not have been ideal, and it would be what sailors and officers would call a tender ship. In addition to this, though, he had a really interesting account of his nights. He was plagued by nightmares, and through the wonders of modern technology, we are going to A, meet Claude Sawyer, and B, hear from his own words what he described. So, ladies and gentlemen, please meet Claude Sawyer.
A man dressed in a peculiar kind of dress, which I had not seen before, with a long sword in his right hand, which he seemed to be holding between us. In the other hand he had a rag covered with blood.
And again, through the wonders of modern technology, I have taken those words and attempted to visualize what they would look like. And this could be a representation of what Claude Sawyer saw. I don't know about you, but if I met this gentleman every night I went to bed, I would absolutely be keen to get off the ship. Claude Sawyer as well explained that that night after he got off the ship in Durban, he did have another dream. He was basically floating in the sky, looking down, and he could see the Waratah through the storm, fighting its way through the waves, until one giant wave slammed into the ship and the Waratah disappeared. Now, he could very well be describing a rogue wave, and we do know that rogue waves are a reality, and they have destroyed ships in the past. So that could potentially be the fate of the Waratah. However, until the wreck is discovered, we just don't know. And so for now, the wreck of the Waratah remains undiscovered, along with those 7,800 gold bars of bullion. For our final ship, it is one that is almost completely forgotten, certainly within Australian maritime circles. It is a ship that could be classified as the nautical equivalent of a serial killer. When officers of the watch and sailors would see this ship coming across their path, they would go out of their way to make sure that they were extra far away from it. Everyone wanted to stay away from this ship. This ship was the wrecker of tonnage. This ship was so infamous that in its own time it was known as the Great Australian Ram. And so I present to you the Barrabool. Excuse me. What you saw there was a stylized reconstruction of one of its many collisions. Entering Australian service in 1874, the Barrabool began to make a name of itself in 1876 when it collided with and sank the much larger steamship, the Queensland, off Wilson's Promontory. In 1879, it collided with and sank the Bonnie Dundee, of which that animation you just saw represents, with the loss of several lives. 5 years after that, in Sydney Harbour, the Barrabool again collided with and damaged the ship called the Birkgate, and then 10 years after that, because old habits die hard, the Barrabool went ahead and collided again at Sydney Harbour and damaged another ship called the Vialele. And I just want to highlight that the image you're seeing up here in the corner, this is again a digital reconstruction of a lithograph that represents the damage to the Barrabool's bow after its first collision with the Queensland. As you can see, this was no trifling maritime fender bender. This was a proper collision with force. The ship's bow has been completely ripped open and its forward bulkheads have been exposed. The career of the Barrabool officially came at an end in 1912 when it ran aground off the Fitzroy River near Brisbane, in the state of Queensland. Once the ship was refloated, its owners, Howard Smith Shipping Company, decided that enough was enough. The ship was stripped, all machinery and fittings were removed, and the Barrabool was converted into a coal hulk. Finally, in 1950, with no longer needed, the ship was simply towed out to the ship's graveyard off Sydney Heads and scuttled there. And there it remains to this day. This veritable serial killer of ships could be described as bad luck, or, more scientifically, it has now been determined that its rudder was just too small for both its size and for the power of its engines. So potentially, because the rudder just didn't give it the turning power it needed, it was sluggish in its maneuverability, and that could have been one of the factors why it just liked to keep hitting ships. It is all but forgotten, but it is a story that is worth highlighting, especially as Australia's maritime scene has pretty much all but disappeared. And so there you have it. I hope you've enjoyed my brief discussion of some of these vessels. If you'd like more information, or if you'd like me to focus more on some of these ships, please let me know. And as well, let me know what you think about some of these digital illustrations. If you'd like to see more of that, just let me know. Next week, we will return to our usual programming with standard book reviews. But until then, happy reading, safe Halloweening, and all of the above.